and more recently last year when it invaded Ukraine. R2P advocates and the Society of States almost universally rejected Russia's abuse of R2P. Even the People's Republic of China refused to endorse or support Russian action in both cases. So this shows that simply invoking R2P to justify aggression does not work, and we shouldn't therefore treat this Trojan horse argument seriously. Nor should we believe that Russia somehow would have been constrained from invading these two countries if R2P did not exist. There are plenty of other justifications that the Kremlin could have manufactured, and many of which it did in fact manufacture. Now, part of the reason this argument is persuasive to a lot of people is that the international community does intervene in some conflicts and not in others. But this often reflects real factual differences between different crises that are going on in different parts of the world and good faith disagreements about how to respond. Now let's consider Syria. Since the Syrian uprising began in 2011, experts and commentators across the political spectrum have disagreed in good faith about which measures, including the use of force, would prove effective in stopping mass atrocity crimes, or whether they would merely feed the cycle of violence. And the recent political debate we've seen in Canada about whether or not it is wise for Canada to participate in bombing the Islamic State merely underscores the fact that people of good faith can disagree about questions of this nature. The third point I'd like to make is that the fact that states sometimes have selfish motivations or national interests that underlie humanitarian actions that they take does not discredit these humanitarian actions. It's actually reasonable to believe that most states have a national interest in seeing a world in which mass atrocity crimes do not occur or are less frequent, considering the grave cross-border consequences that they can produce. Syria is one case in point. It's interesting that since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, Western states have provided humanitarian aid to Syrian refugees in neighboring countries, though as we've seen in the news lately, this aid is clearly insufficient. But why did this happen? Certainly humanitarian considerations played a role, but so did national interest. Countries saw aid as a way to prevent radicalization in refugee camps and to help stabilize Western allies, such as Turkey and Jordan. Now, there was clearly a mix of these national interests and humanitarian considerations at play, but this should not distract us from the fact that this aid provided protection, sustained refugee populations, and made it possible for Syria's neighbors to open their borders and accept more than 4 million people as refugees. The final point that I'll tackle is the claim that R2P has just failed to galvanize action. And this is certainly a hard one to argue with when we see the Syrian civil war going on for more than 4 years now, and so many conflicts in other parts of the world. Never again doesn't seem to mean much in practice. But this claim overlooks the cases where R2P has genuinely galvanized action and provided effective protection to people in peril. A little-known case is in Kenya in 2008, when a dispute over the outcome of the elections caused mass violence that left over 1,000 people dead. The former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan mediated a solution. In his autobiography, he said that R2P was key to his approach, and that the parties to that conflict accepted the deal he proposed because of the diplomatic and economic pressure applied under an R2P framework by the United States, the European Union, and UN agencies. We could also consider the case of the Central African Republic, where when there were reports of killing along religious lines that seemed to be leading toward genocide, the Security Council reacted rapidly by dispatching a joint peacekeeping force that had a mandate to use force to protect civilians. This force couldn't protect everyone or ensure security for everyone, but it did make a tangible difference in deterring the worst atrocity crimes. But the final point I'd like to make is that discrediting R2P as a principle because we don't see it applied in our world in some ways misses the point, because this actually underlines the urgent need for states to devote political commitment and resources to implementing R2P. Now, R2P is not a magic formula. Like other principles in international relations, such as the idea that states should offer protection to refugees, the protection of women's rights or human rights, it's a principle that's in need of implementation. At the UN dialogue on R2P that happened last week, the Canadian Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on R2P, Dr. Jennifer Welsh, highlighted a comment that one member state made, and that this comment went like this: "A principle alone can't protect, political will and resources are needed." Now let's consider the refugee crisis for a moment, since that's been in the news so much lately. If you would seriously suggest that the fact that some states are failing to protect the refugees that are approaching the borders or offer them protection discredits the whole idea of refugee protection. Instead, the plight faced by refugees and the fact that many states are unwilling to accept them underlines the need to implement the protection of refugees principle and agenda. And it's this idea that's motivated civil society groups in Canada and elsewhere to push governments to show more generosity and live up to their moral and legal obligations under the Refugee Convention and other international instruments. So just to sum up, as Dr. Jennifer Walsh highlighted, RGP is still a very young principle by the standards of international principles. It's only 10 years old. It will undoubtedly continue to grow and develop over its career, just as obligations surrounding human rights, refugee protection, protection of minorities have. And I'd say that it's incumbent on each of us not to let the terrible failures to protect that we've seen in Syria and elsewhere cause us to lose faith in international efforts to protect people in peril. Instead, I think these failures are a cause to redouble our commitment and to urge Canada and other states to put real political commitment and resources on the line. Thank you.
All right, three very interesting, well thought out talks. Perhaps I could persuade you to bring 2 chairs up. Maybe you have 3 speakers to sit at the front to take some questions from the audience. Does anyone want to launch in? Otherwise, I have things I might ask. Oh, go on to that.
This is a question for Clara. I've read kind of vaguely on the internet that students prefer beer to water, kind of pre-modern sanitation systems to avoid disease. Is that true? And is that part of this idea that wine is healthier than water?
Yeah, beer, cider would have been the normal mealtime drink for anyone, or even, pretty much everyone. This was, and they thought it was healthier for some good reasons. First of all, people were most of the time malnourished, so it was a good source of calories. This is just they drank it, and the people who drank beer felt better than those who didn't. And so they were probably healthier because they just simply had more calories. And secondly, it is likely that water was probably often contaminated. Sewage systems might not have been great. So, I mean, I think it's a little exaggerated to say that people never drank water at all, which is what I've heard sometimes. But I do think that, even children would have what's called small beer from even babies. So people were drinking quite a lot, especially in the early modern period.
I have a question for Sandy. Your title kind of encompassed this idea of compounding mistakes of human law in terms of how it's related to sexual assault. And how do you see in terms of how precedents and sort of case-by-case situations have either compounded those mistakes further or have helped to sort of untether the mistakes for human business?
Yeah, so I think that's where you get if the talk is another 45 minutes long.
No, that's right.
In essence, the whole jurisprudence on it starts in the mid-90s, early 90s really, when there's the HIV/AIDS panic. And we don't really know what the cause is. It's ending when it's known as the gay disease, and you get court decisions that are very reactionary to that. And so from that, you get that dishonest act plus deprivation test. And that sits there in 1998, the SEC, the Supreme Court of Canada dictates that as the test. And then it isn't touched again in any meaningful or substantive matter until 2012, when they come out with this low viral load plus condom with vaginal intercourse means you don't need to disclose. And so there's no real clarity that's added by this, and in fact, they kind of just double down on this test rather than what a lot of people were hoping for, which was to kick it back to Parliament, to come up with something other than sexual assault. Because at its core, sexual assault is really about protecting your bodily integrity and your freedom to choose, and that if the science isn't backing what the court is deciding these days, that we need something else. And as it stands, the court's not well positioned to make up a whole new crime, despite the fact that they seem to be just trying to shove it in there with sexual assault. If that answers the question.
Yeah, yes, thank you.
So like, would there be an analogous, so like, would any kind of like two-person interaction that transmitted a disease that I failed to inform the other person would also be covered under kind of similar umbrella? Like something besides sexual intercourse?
Oh man, this sounds like you are asking me for legal advice. Hypothetically, if you were in a position where there's an assault, and the fraud modifies the assault to take away the consent in the assault. So you can agree, you and I can agree to touching in any form, whether it's sexual or not, and fraud takes away that. So if there is some serious risk of substantial bodily harm caused by whatever the touching is, yes. All of this starts with venereal disease in a case called Clarence from the Victorian age. And it just kind of tracks forward to this complete, when you read it and you do the numbers, botching of science.
I have a question for Misha. So the case that you laid out in your talk sort of assumes that an antagonist or an opponent to R2P. Who's opposing R2P right now? Who would you say his biggest detractors are?
Well, because R2P is part of international relations, there's a considerable group of scholars within the academy who are critical of it, just as there are scholars who are critical of other principles. But I think within the community of states, you really see two groups. On the one hand, there's a small group of states, I think this would be Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, very small handful who reject the R2P principle as a whole. They think it's illegitimate for a lot of the reasons that I outlined in my presentation. There's a much larger number of states. This includes states like Russia and China, as well as some states in different parts of Asia and the Middle East, who accept the R2P principle, but place the emphasis mainly on the responsibility of each state to protect and on the international community's responsibility to provide assistance with state consent, and are very hesitant about taking any coercive measures, even coercive measures short of the use of force. So, there's been a really strong consensus built over the last 10 years about the importance of prevention and each state's responsibility to protect its own people. It's really the dispute over what the international community's responsibility to act when states are failing in their responsibilities looks like and which measures are appropriate. This debate was really triggered by Libya in 2011. It was, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but it's a complicated case because the Security Council authorized intervention. There were 10 states that voted for it, including Britain, France, and the United States. And there were 5 states that abstained. These included China, Russia, Brazil, Germany, and India, all of which are pretty powerful states. They abstained because they didn't want to look bad for opposing intervention, especially since the Arab League and the Arab League and African Union had all been supportive in that case, but they also wanted to signify that they still had doubts about applying this principle and what the consequences would be. So it's really the Libya debate that kickstarted the challenges to R2P over how you respond when there are mass atrocities going on.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay, so this one's for you again. So in that sense, because there's a minority of states that are challenging R2P, so you're kind of creating a strawman argument. But I guess to take it further, try to problematize your notion of humanitarian, like what kind of humanitarian moral obligation that states exercise over other states, because it assumes that certain states are hegemonic over other states. It erases the fact that there is a third world, there is a global south created versus a global north that is exercising more international agency over applying RTP principles. So just to kind of tease out your notions
Sure.
of humanitarian metrics, of
Yeah.
even just the question of, you know, what moral principles are under consensus if there are any.
Sure, yeah, so it's a good question, and, you know, it's exactly that concern that you raised that makes this such a controversial subject. In the 19th century, it was common for Western powers to use various humanitarian justifications to excuse actions of imperialism, right? So, and this is always a concern about R2P. A couple things I'd say. The doctrine, as I mentioned before, tries to take the focus away from the right of the intervening power to use force whenever it feels appropriate for humanitarian reasons, which was basically the system we had during the 19th century, and instead shifts the language to the responsibility of the whole international community, not just a small subset of powerful states. And then it subjects the use of force to the authorization of the UN Security Council. Now, it's true that this is an imperfect body and that the developing world is not as represented on that body as we would like to see fully, but it's frankly the best body that we have to authorize the use of force. There have been attempts to reform the Security Council, create alternate bodies, and they haven't gone anywhere. As far as, it's an interesting, often overlooked point about R2P that it was actually endorsed by the African Union before it was adopted by the UN. And R2P-like provisions were actually embedded in the charter of the African Union. This was known as the Eswatini Consensus.
But that's also token African diplomacy, is it not?
Well, it was,
Because like it's a certain elite body with obviously new colonial vested interests.
are you talking about the African Union?
Yeah.
Perhaps so this discussion could continue momentarily. We have two other speakers
What
here.
I would say is that African states, while they are very cautious and often opposed to Western powers intervening in Africa, accept the idea that mass atrocities are a bad thing and are often comfortable with other African states intervening. So I'll leave it at that.
Further questions? Julia in the back.
I have a question for Sandy.
Sure.
So, if there's anything that your talk really emphasized to me is that disclosure of information can be something rather complicated. And I'm just wondering if there are any cases in which HIV disclosure law has influenced maybe other types of medical information disclosure issues, or do you think that could have really influenced how that happened?
Some, but because of how it's drawn in terms of fraud, medical disclosure law is distinct. It's premised less on. Okay, so now I'm outside of my wheelhouse. My understanding is that medical consent is conditioned on the informed consent factors in somehow, but in a very different way, and it's civil assault. It's actually battery rather than criminal assault. So the interplay is not as close as I think you would hope, and even when you compare, for example, civil sexual assault, civil suits, the underlying premise is very, very different. And the way that it's set up is very different. Criminal law requires you to demonstrate that there is an absence of consent, whereas civil battery assumes there's an absence of consent. And so in fact makes the weird declaration at an academic level that all sex is battery. And then requires the complaint, the accused in a civil suit to prove that there was consent. It's very, very weird, and no one ever sues anyone for it, but at a technical level there is a bit of a...
It's a very strange interplay, isn't it?
Not everyone agrees with me on this reading, and I get that not everyone will agree with me on that kind of a reading of the law, but it is this weird reversal of a presumption that because the common law has come to value your right to your body so intensely, that we assume that any trespass to your body means the other person who, you've demonstrated the trespass, the person who trespassed your body must then show why they were allowed to, is essentially the argument. And that's very different from the criminal law where the Crown actually has to show that you intended and you didn't know that there was not consent. Or you knew there was not consent, rather.
I feel like that could just like go into a whole other discussion, but I don't want to keep the rest of the audience for like.
Door's still open
answer.
as far as I know, there's plenty of opportunity, all right.
I have a question for Clara. I was just wondering, because you mentioned sort of as an aside that whether there are records to show that it was Shaw, I believe, who wrote the piece, that he had shares whatever in the wine. But
That
in
was kind
terms
of a
of,
joke. I
well,
found no proof of that at all.
no, that's right. But that sort of got me thinking of the commodification of wine and sort of the emphasis placed on a certain drink within that period. Not only whether this individual, Shaw, had sort of whether a great love of wine or just really in terms of the medical science behind it really did believe it did cure things, but how, maybe at an economic level, of how wine sort of fit within the context of
Class.
the century
Yeah.
and within the class. in that
That's
period.
actually that's a really big discussion in this topic, like consumption, because this is right around the time when Western Europe is exploring the world and they're bringing back all these like goods from everywhere and foods, but also medicines and spices and gold and like anything you could possibly consume in any sense of the word, ideas, is coming into Western Europe, especially England, and also because of it's kind of on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. People are starting to move it to cities, and so as a result, there is kind of a higher standard of living and a higher expectation of the standard of living. And while wine, I'm not really sure whether you can focus on wine as a key point in that, because wine has been around in Western Europe forever. But everything else combined with the wine, all this like new food and like better quality food, like there's a whole like couple books about it, about consumption, and even playing on the term consumption, tuberculosis, and consumption, consuming goods, and like consuming versus being consumed from within your body, and yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure if I answered your question, but there's lots of cool ideas like that out there,
Yeah, no, you
and you can
contextualize
find
it.
them, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Julia.
I have one more question for Clara, actually. So, as I was listening to your lecture, I couldn't help but think that there was like a real, almost a very, very faint link between like the water versus wine discussion back in the time frame that you were discussing versus like, a lot of the debate that's been happening now about like the value of wine for overall health. I don't know. I mean, there's there's been lots of like hype around like red wine is like high in oxidants, so it's good for your health. So I was
What I was thinking when I read this treatise was vitamins.
Yeah.
Like the way he talked about, or not even just vitamins, but like I don't know, if you have like friends who post strange things that they're hawking on their Facebook, like these magic, weight loss or vitamin drinks, stuff like that. That's what it reminded me of, because it said it was like he kept harping on the fact that it was pure nourishment, but also like energy, and it would like it would use your own bodily system and like revive it and make it healthy, without actually having to consume anything substantial that might toxify you. Like he didn't use the word toxins, but I think if he lived now he would have. It's kind of interesting how things don't change.
Yeah. It's interesting because the way in which the discourse has really progressed has the terminology and the types of like things that we link it to may be different, but it really does appear to me that the way in which it's discussed, perhaps there's some parallels drawn between both time frames.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure that anyone, because we know about alcohol and like what it does to your liver at this point, so we can't really make the claim that wine is something pure that your body doesn't have to purge out, because it definitely does. But funnily enough, he actually talks about alcohol, like what happens when people drink too much alcohol and they start vomiting and getting sick. And he says, well, this is actually more evidence of how healthy wine is, because because you drink too much wine, you get horribly sick, but then like within a day or so, you're fine. And the fact that you bounce back so quickly and you've gotten like all the bad stuff out of your system means that like it's clearly better for you.
Food for thought. Any further questions? Matt, and then,
You're listening over there.
oh, sorry, there's one. Oh, two. Oh, geez, okay, sorry. Go ahead.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that consumption had become fashionable. Was that what you said?
Yeah, to a degree, especially in the middle of the 18th century, not really necessarily the illness, but like the aesthetic.
Because I see. Okay, I was going to check that. Consumption is an infectious disease.
Yeah, but like Moulin Rouge is not, it's a modern sort of idea, but the idea has been there since that period, and it's mostly the aesthetic.
Matt.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, you're saying in your last answer there, that when you're reading this treatise, you sort of felt like this stuff, it was similar to what you're seeing on Facebook with these posts of these things that are great for you. Did anybody actually did anybody actually listen to this guy? Like, is it just something that he wrote, or did people actually follow his advice and drink wine as a health?
To hear him talk, yes, because like the treatise isn't. It's not just a prescriptive thing. He's got a whole list in the second half of it that's like, as I said, dozens and dozens of cases where he supposedly cured people. Sometimes there were people who were reluctant. They said, your ideas are absurd. Like, I can't take wine or port. And he's very specific about the different kinds of wine that you need to take for different illnesses. But I mean, it's hard to. We don't really have any proof. But he says.
But, I mean, there's like no independent information like from somewhere else that you've read. Like, I don't know, other information from the time saying that people were following this.
Not
wine
that
diet or
I've
something.
read that followed his ideas specifically, but there were certainly people who followed this sort of notion of consumption equals good. So consuming alcohol, consuming meat is the way to health. But he claims that there were tons and tons of cases where he managed to cure people.
Still sounds like Facebook.
Yeah.
So whether his shares in the wine companies paid off or not is a mystery. Amit, and then you.
So this is for Sammy. With the laws to treat HIV something in a category of its own, and given like modern retroviral treatment, maybe the prognosis given an HIV diagnosis is not that dissimilar from like other STDs. So do you think that distinction will change maybe going towards accepting other diseases as being part of sexual assault, or the other way around, of kind of moving HIV to being part of the risk of these sorts of activities?
There's a really good paper to be written there. So I think what you see when you see the way that HIV is treated in this context is you see the stigma. People still get like 7-year jail sentences for spitting while being HIV positive.
In Canada?
Yeah, in Canada, like in the last year. And like pretty clear that there's actually no way to communicate HIV that way. And so when I say the science really doesn't check out, I mean, it really doesn't check out. In theory, what actually should happen is we should prosecute all diseases the same way. They've come up with this very basic formula that is deprivation and deceit. And where there's the deprivation, which regardless of what the disease is, it's there, we ought to treat it the same. And in fact, the way that you know that there is a principle at criminal law that you have to take the victim as you find them. And so, in theory, if the victim doesn't get treated for another disease, it's just as serious. That's how we make up this fictitious idea that HIV is still a serious risk, when in fact it's a chronic disease. And when you look at it, and when you look at numbers in, for example, Vancouver, people my age with HIV live longer than I will. If you are a person living with HIV, you will see your doctor every 6 months. You will actually have blood work done every 6 months. And it turns out you will have all sorts of other terminal conditions diagnosed infinitely sooner than I will. So, you know, it makes no sense, is I think all that answer is to say.
People die from HPV.
Yeah, and that I mean, there are other diseases from which you could also die, and we just don't treat them the same because it just doesn't have the same stigma.
Finding health in the strangest places. Okay.
This is for Vera. Sorry, what time period are you looking at?
Early modern, so 1600 to 1800, and at least for this particular topic.
Okay, great. So I'm curious, how did discourse on wine and health change under like the birth of French gastronomy? Because BSFFM was writing at the same time, right, like around the late 1700s. And obviously, like his school of thought started embracing like hedonism, pleasure, as form of identity making. So I'm wondering how
I
the
could see him
medical-
on the side of the pro-hearty consumption people. I've never read anything specifically about him, or any like real academic stuff about him. But it's probably part of the whole idea of consuming quantities of good quality things, whether it be
It's like
possessions
consumption
or
culture just taking a
Yeah.
place of wine. I guess.
yeah. I guess that's the ultimate glorification of consuming.
Any further questions? All right, well, I'd like to thank our speakers for coming to and I would personally like to thank you all for coming out this evening. It's wonderful to see so many new faces in the audience. The next session is on October 6th. It will be in the same place. There will be the same coffee, tea, maybe sweets, I don't know. Drink tickets, assuming I can get funding for them. And the topic for the next session will be the best of all possible worlds. And I look forward to seeing you all, or perhaps seeing some of you present there. So, thank you and good night.